The rain in Oregon did not simply fall. It assaulted the earth. It came down in relentless, icy sheets that turned the rich, dark soil of the Vance orchard into a thick, clinging mud that threatened to swallow boots whole. I stood on the porch of the farmhouse where I had spent the last 35 years of my life, listening to the water hammer against the new slate roof. It was a roof I had paid for with the ache in my joints. The early mornings that started before the sun dared to crest the Cascades, and the calluses that had turned my hands into rough tools of labor. But in that moment, I wasn't looking at the roof or the storm. I was looking at my daughter, Maya. She stood beside her husband, Julian, sheltered under the expensive overhang of the renovated patio. Her arms were crossed tightly over a designer raincoat that probably cost more than my first car, a barrier against the damp chill. Her face, usually so full of the warmth and vibrancy I had cherished since she was an infant, was now a mask of icy indifference, a stranger's face wearing my daughter's skin. "You have two choices, Elara," Maya said. Her voice cut through the rhythmic drumming of the downpour with surgical precision, devoid of any tremor or hesitation. "You can move into the retrofitted supply closet in the basement, the one next to the boiler, or you can take your things and sleep in the barn with the goats. Those are your options. Pick now." The words did not just hurt, they disoriented me. It was a physical sensation, as if the ground beneath me had suddenly liquefied. I looked at Julian. He was checking his smartwatch, tapping the screen with an air of bored impatience, as if evicting his mother-in-law was a tedious calendar appointment that was running overtime and eating into his schedule. I looked back at Maya, searching desperately for a trace of the little girl who used to cry when we had to prune the dead branches from the apple trees because she thought we were hurting them. There was nothing. Just a cold, calculated stare that treated me like an obsolete piece of machinery taking up valuable square footage in their new eco-resort venture. What she didn't know, what neither of them knew as they stood there in their arrogance, was that I had been keeping a secret for 30 years. A secret that lay heavy in a rusted lockbox at the back of my closet. A secret that would change everything between us. And in that moment, as the wind whipped my gray hair across my face and the humiliation burned in my chest like a hot coal, I decided it was time to use the only weapon I had left. The truth. My name is Elara Vance. I am 58 years old, and for the majority of my life, I subscribed to the foolish, romantic notion that maternal love was a currency that never devalued. I believed that if I poured every ounce of my soul into my daughter, if I starved so she could eat, if I worked until my spine felt like fused glass so she could stand tall, she would understand. I thought sacrifice was a universal language. Life, however, has a brutal way of teaching you that sacrifice is often interpreted as weakness, and silence is mistaken for submission. I raised Maya alone on this sprawling, demanding plot of land in the Pacific Northwest. Her father, Silas, had walked out on us when she was barely 4 years old. He didn't just leave, he evaporated into the ether, leaving behind a mountain of gambling debts, a foreclosure notice stapled to the front door, and a shattered trust that took me decades to rebuild. I could have sold the land back then. Developers had been circling the valley like vultures for years, eager to turn our heritage into subdivisions. But Maya loved the orchard. She loved the scent of the apple blossoms in spring, a sweetness that hung in the air like perfume. She loved the harvest in autumn, when the air turned crisp and the smell of fermenting fruit filled the valley. So, I kept going. I worked days as a line cook at a diner in town, smelling of grease and onions, and nights processing the fruit, canning preserves, and managing the books that were always bleeding red ink. I aged in dog years. My hands became rough textures of sandpaper and scars, forever stained with walnut ink or berry juice. My back hurt constantly, a dull throb that became the soundtrack of my existence. But every time I saw Maya smile, every time she twirled in a new dress I had sewn for her late at night, I thought it was all worth it. I paid for her education, her clothes, her dreams. When she wanted to go to a prestigious college in Seattle to study business, I sold off 3 parcels of uncultivated woodland land that had been in my family for generations just to pay for her first 2 years. It was in Seattle that she met Julian. He was a tech entrepreneur, or at least that's what he called himself. To me, he looked like a boy, playing dress-up in expensive suits, speaking in buzzwords I couldn't understand. He talked about synergy and disruption and ROI. The first time he came to visit us, I noticed immediately how he looked at our simple life with contempt. He wrinkled his nose at the smell of the compost, raised an eyebrow at the peeling paint on the barn, and looked at my calloused hands with a veiled disgust, as if hard work was a contagious disease he needed to inoculate himself against. But Maya was infatuated. She began to see her home not through the lens of memory, but through his critical eyes. The farmhouse wasn't cozy, it was cramped. The orchard wasn't a legacy, it was an underutilized asset. They got married 3 years later in a ceremony that I used my last savings to help pay for. It was a lavish affair on the coast, filled with people I didn't know. Julian didn't even say thank you. He just smiled that fake, plastic smile and complained that the champagne wasn't the specific vintage he had requested. That day, for the first time, I felt like I was losing my daughter. Not to marriage, but to a world I didn't belong to. The first few years were calm, but distant. Maya visited occasionally, always in a rush, always checking her phone, always criticizing the way I kept the house. I pretended not to notice the growing distance between us until 2 years ago. Everything changed when the news came. Silas, my ex-husband, the man who had abandoned us without a backward glance, had died in a car accident in Chicago. I never imagined that the man who left us with nothing would have anything to leave behind. But during the years he was away, Silas had reinvented himself. He had built a small fortune through investments and venture capital. And for some reason I will never understand, perhaps out of guilt or perhaps out of spite, he left everything to Maya. $400,000, an amount that felt like winning the lottery for us. When the lawyer gave us the news, I saw the gleam in my daughter's eyes. It wasn't joy, it wasn't relief. It was something deeper and more disturbing. It was ambition. Julian was by her side, and his smile sent a shiver down my spine. It was the look of a predator spotting a wounded animal. In that moment, I had a bad feeling, a tightening in my gut, but I pushed it away. Maya was my daughter, the girl I raised with so much love. She would never turn her back on me. How wrong I was. 3 months after receiving the inheritance, Maya and Julian showed up at my house with a proposal. They wanted to build a luxury glamping resort on the land, taking advantage of the region's growing tourism industry. They called it the Canopy. They showed me blueprints, 3D renderings on an iPad, and projected profit margins. They needed me to sign some documents temporarily transferring the property into their names to get the necessary financing and commercial permits. Something inside me screamed not to sign those papers. The land was my safety net, my identity. But Maya took my rough hands in her manicured ones and looked at me with those big, earnest eyes. "Mom, trust me," she said, her voice dripping with honey. "We're going to build something beautiful here, and part of the plan is a cottage for you. A beautiful, modern cottage on the hill overlooking the valley. You'll be able to live out your last years in comfort without having to work so hard. You'll be the matriarch of the estate." Julian added, his voice smooth as silk, "Miss Alara, you deserve to rest. We'll take care of everything. You've done enough. Let us take the burden now." I signed. God forgive me, but I signed. I wanted to believe them. I wanted to be the mother who supported her daughter's dreams, not the obstacle in her path. Construction began 2 months later. It was a violent process. They tore down the old fences I had mended 1,000 times. They cut down the ancient oak tree where Maya used to have a swing. They remodeled the farmhouse, stripping away its character and replacing it with modern, sterile minimalism. The transformation was fast and brutal. And along with the remodeling of the property came the change in how Maya treated me. First, it was small things. She started correcting me in front of the contractors, saying that I didn't understand the vision, that my ideas were outdated. She criticized my clothes, my cooking, the way I spoke. Then she started treating me like an employee in my own home. She asked me to clean up after the workers, to cook lunch for the architects, to do the laundry. I obeyed, thinking I was helping, that it was my contribution to the family business. But things got worse. The cottage on the hill never materialized. "Budget cuts," Julian said, not even looking up from his phone when I asked. "We had to prioritize the guest suites. We'll get to it next year." They moved me out of the master bedroom, claiming they needed it for an office. I was moved to the guest room, and then, as the resort opened and bookings started to come in, to a tiny, windowless room off the kitchen that used to be a pantry. It was humiliating. And then, 3 months ago, I discovered the truth. I was looking for my birth certificate in the study drawer when I found the property papers. I read them with trembling hands. The house, the land, the orchard, everything was registered in Maya's and Julian's names permanently. There was no clause about transferring it back. It wasn't temporary. They had tricked me. I confronted my daughter that very night. She didn't even blink. She was drinking wine in the newly renovated living room, looking at her tablet. "Mom, you're old," she said with a coldness that cut me like a knife. "You don't understand how business works. We did what was best for the asset. Now you have a place to live without worries. You should be grateful." Grateful. The words stuck in my throat. I tried to argue, to scream that this house was mine, that I had built everything with my sweat and blood. She rolled her eyes and left the room. From that day on, the treatment got even worse. Maya called me dead weight. She called me a burden. Julian laughed at her cruel jokes about my age, about my tired body, about my trembling hands. And I, like a fool, stayed there enduring everything because she was my daughter, and I still held out hope that she would go back to being the sweet girl I raised. Until that rainy Tuesday morning. I had woken up early as always, made coffee for the guests, and cleaned the mud from the reception area floors. My back hurt more than usual, the dampness seeping into my bones. Around 10 in the morning, Maya stormed into the kitchen like a hurricane. Her face was red with rage. "Mom, I warned you not to touch the guests' things," she screamed. I was confused, wiping my hands on my apron. But I didn't touch anything. I was just cleaning the room like you asked me to. She pointed to a shattered vase on the floor of the hallway. "That vase cost $500. You clumsy old woman. You're useless now. You're destroying the brand." I tried to explain that I hadn't broken any vase, that maybe a guest had knocked it over or the wind had blown a door shut, but she wouldn't listen. Julian appeared in the doorway with that malicious smile I had learned to fear. "Maya, honey, we talked about this," he said calmly, pouring fuel on the fire. "Your mom is getting too old to help here. She's a liability. She scares the guests with her appearance." Maya nodded, her eyes hardening. And then she said the words that changed everything, the ultimatum. "Either you go to the basement room next to the boiler, or you go sleep with the goats in the barn. You choose." The silence that followed was deafening. I looked at my daughter, searching for any sign that this was a cruel joke, an empty threat born of stress. But her eyes were serious, determined. She was really giving me that ultimatum. That's when something inside me broke. It wasn't my heart, which had been in pieces for months. It was something different. It was the fear. It was the submission. It was the foolish hope that things could get better if I just loved her enough. All of that vanished, and in its place arose a cold, crystal-clear certainty. "All right," I said, my voice coming out firmer than I expected. "I'm leaving." Maya looked surprised. Maybe she expected me to beg, to cry, to humiliate myself even more to stay in the warmth. "But first," I continued, walking past them toward the kitchen, "I need to get my things." I went to that cramped, windowless pantry room where I had spent the last few months. My hands were trembling, not from fear, but from adrenaline. I pulled my old, battered suitcase from under the cot. I packed 2 changes of clothes, my toothbrush, and a photo album. I didn't need anything else from that house. Everything that truly mattered was in the rusty metal lockbox hidden at the back of the closet. I took the box and opened it. Inside lay a yellowed manila envelope I had kept hidden for 3 decades. I ran my thumb over the seal. I had sworn I would only use this as a last resort. And the last resort had arrived. I walked out the back door, bypassing the porch where they still stood, and trudged through the mud to my old pickup truck. "Where are you going?" Julian shouted, realizing I wasn't heading for the barn. Don't think you can take the truck. That's company property now. I ignored him. I fired up the engine, which coughed and sputtered before roaring to life. I drove away, the tires spinning in the mud before finding traction. I didn't look back. I drove straight to the only person I could trust, my old friend Sarah, who lived 10 miles down the coast. Sarah took me in without question. She fed me hot soup, wrapped me in a blanket, and listened as I poured out the story, my voice breaking as I recounted the humiliation, the betrayal, the barn. "You have to fight them, Elara," Sarah said, her eyes fierce with indignation. "You can't let them do this. You built that place." "I'm not just going to fight them," I said, placing the manila envelope on her kitchen table. "I'm going to dismantle them." The next morning, the rain had stopped, leaving the world washed clean and gray. I dressed carefully in my best blouse and drove to the county seat. I walked into the office of Arthur Pendleton, the most ruthless estate attorney in the region. He was a man of few words and sharp suits, known for destroying opponents in court. I sat across from him and pushed the envelope across the mahogany desk. "What is this?" he asked. "The truth about Silas's money," I said, "and the leverage I need to take my life back." Arthur opened the envelope. Inside were documents that detailed a history I had tried to protect Maya from. When Silas abandoned us 30 years ago, he wasn't just running away from fatherhood. He was fleeing a felony. My ex-husband had embezzled nearly $1 million from the investment firm where he worked. He was a white-collar criminal. He had contacted me a year after he left, terrified. He sent me a confession, bank records, and a notarized deed of trust. He had transferred ownership of all his future assets to me in a panic, trying to hide them from the feds, thinking that if the assets were in my name, they couldn't be seized if he was caught. He begged me to keep it secret, promising he would pay the money back. He never paid it back. He invested it, hid it, and grew it. The inheritance Maya received, that $400,000, was the fruit of that crime. But more importantly, the document Arthur was holding proved that legally, Silas had no right to leave that money to Maya. According to the deed of trust he had signed to protect himself, those assets belonged to me. Arthur reviewed the documents for a long hour. When he finally looked up, he took off his glasses. "Elara, do you realize what this means? If we present this, the will is contested. The money Maya used to buy the orchard and build the resort, it wasn't hers to spend. And since she used illicit funds to unknowingly defraud you into signing the deed, we can petition to nullify the transfer of the property." "I know," I said. "This will ruin her financially," Arthur warned. "Julian will likely leave her when the money dries up. The scandal could be significant." "She tried to make me sleep with the goats, Arthur," I said, my voice devoid of emotion. "She made her choice. Now I'm making mine." We filed the injunctions 3 days later. I didn't go to the orchard to deliver the news. I let the sheriff do it. Sarah told me about it later. News travels fast in small towns. The sheriff arrived right in the middle of a tour Julian was giving to potential investors. The look on his face when he was served the papers was, apparently, worth the price of admission. The weeks that followed were a blur of legal wrangling. Maya and Julian tried to fight it, of course. They hired a high-priced firm from the city, funded by credit cards they could no longer pay off. But facts are stubborn things. The documentation was irrefutable. The money was fruit from a poisonous tree, and the deed transfer was voided under the premise of fraud and duress. During that time, I stayed with Sarah. I painted watercolors of the angry ocean to keep my mind off the fact that I was destroying my own child. I cried at night, mourning the relationship I had lost, but I never wavered. I couldn't. It took 4 months. Finally, the judgment came down. The orchard was mine. The improvements, the cabins, the event hall, the landscaping were attached to the land, and thus were mine too. Maya and Julian were ordered to repay the portion of the inheritance they had spent, which meant they were effectively bankrupt. They were given 30 days to vacate. On the 29th day, I drove back to the orchard. The place was quiet. The construction crews were gone. The canopy sign had been taken down, leaving a pale rectangle on the stone gate. I parked the truck and walked up to the farmhouse. I found Maya in the main living room, packing boxes. She looked terrible. She had lost weight, her hair was pulled back in a messy bun, and the arrogant shine was gone from her eyes, replaced by a dull, red-rimmed exhaustion. The house echoed with emptiness. Julian was nowhere to be seen. "He left yesterday," Maya said, not turning around, knowing it was me. Her voice was raspy. "Said he couldn't be with a failure. Said I tricked him about the inheritance." She let out a dry, bitter laugh. "Irony is a bitch, isn't it?" I stood in the doorway, watching her. I had won. Justice had been served. But as I looked at my defeated daughter, I didn't feel the triumph I had expected. I felt a hollow ache in the center of my chest. I had saved my dignity, but I had orphaned my heart. "You have to be out by noon tomorrow," I said. Maya turned to face me. Tears were streaming down her face, cutting tracks through the dust on her cheeks. "I know. I'm going. I'm sorry, Mom. I know it doesn't mean anything now, but I am. I got lost. I wanted his approval so bad I forgot who I was. I forgot who you were." She looked so small. It would have been easy to crush her then, to let her leave and never speak to her again. That is what revenge looks like. But I remembered the lesson I had learned during those long nights at Sarah's house. Revenge burns the person holding the torch just as much as the victim. I didn't want to live in the ashes. "Leave the boxes," I said. Maya blinked, confused. "What?" "Sit down, Maya." I pulled out a chair at the kitchen table, the same table where she used to do her homework while I canned peaches. I placed a folder on the table. It wasn't a legal threat. It was a contract I had drawn up with Arthur the night before. "I am offering you a settlement," I said. Maya approached the table warily, like a beaten dog expecting another blow. "I don't have any money left, Mom." He took the car. He took the accounts. "I don't want money. I have the land. I have the resort you built, which, frankly, is quite beautiful despite Julian's taste." I opened the folder. "Here are the terms. Listen carefully, because I will not repeat them. Condition 1. I own the land and the business. 100%. You have no equity. You are not a partner." Maya nodded slowly. "I understand." Condition 2. You and I will run this place together. I will handle the agriculture and the books. You will handle the hospitality and the guests. You will work for a salary. A fair salary, but a salary. You are an employee. Maya looked up, confusion warring with a fragile hope in her eyes. Condition 3, I continued, my voice hardening. You will pay rent to live in the cottage on the hill. The one you promised to build for me. I am going to have it built immediately. You will not live in the main house. That is my house. You need to learn what it costs to maintain a roof over your head. And condition 4, we attend family therapy. Once a week, indefinitely, until I say we stop. Maya stared at me, her mouth slightly open. "Why?" she whispered. "After what I did. After I told you to sleep in the barn. Why would you do this?" "Because you are my daughter," I said, my voice cracking for the first time. "And because I failed you too. I taught you that love was about giving until you have nothing left. I raised you to be entitled because I wanted to shield you from the struggle I went through. We are both broken, Maya. And this farm is the only thing that knows how to put us back together." She broke down then. Not the pretty, manipulative crying she used to do when she wanted a new dress, but deep, ugly sobs that shook her frame. She fell to her knees and buried her face in her hands. I went to her. I knelt beside her on the hardwood floor and held her. It didn't fix everything. It didn't erase the barn or the basement or the insults. But it was a start. The road to reconciliation was not paved with asphalt. It was a dirt road full of potholes and mud. The first few months were brutal. Maya moved into a small trailer on the property while the cottage was being built. She worked hard, harder than I had ever seen her work. She cleaned toilets, she checked in guests, she dealt with complaints. She learned the value of a dollar earned with sweat. The therapy sessions were even harder. We sat in Dr. Eris's office every Thursday at 4 p.m. We screamed, we accused. I had to face the fact that my martyrdom had been a form of control, a way to make myself indispensable. Maya had to face her narcissism, her deep-seated insecurity, and her desperate need for external validation. There were days when I wanted to fire her, days when she wanted to quit, but we kept showing up. Julian tried to come back once the business started making money again. About 8 months later, a shiny convertible pulled up to the gate. I met him there, holding a pair of pruning shears, with the sheriff on speed dial. He didn't even get out of the car. He saw the look on my face, reversed down the driveway, and we never saw him again. It took 2 years for the wounds to turn into scars. Scars are tough. They don't hurt anymore, but they remind you of where the skin was broken. We finished the cottage on the hill, and Maya moved in. We realized we needed our own spaces to breathe. One crisp autumn evening, 5 years after the ultimatum, I was sitting on the porch of the farmhouse. The rain had returned, but this time it was a gentle drizzle, nourishing the earth rather than assaulting it. The air smelled of wood smoke and ripening apples. The resort was full. I could hear guests laughing near the fire pits down by the creek. Maya walked up the steps, holding a sleeping toddler in her arms, my grandson, Leo. She looked different now. Her hands were a little rougher. Her face had fine lines around the eyes from smiling, and she wore a flannel shirt instead of designer silk. She sat beside me in the rocking chair. She didn't say anything for a long time, just watching the sunset paint the clouds in shades of purple and gold. "He asked about the goats today," Maya whispered, stroking Leo's hair. "I told him that maybe when he's older, we can get a pony." "Goats are easier," I said, smiling, "and they eat the brambles." Maya laughed softly. It was a genuine sound, rich and warm. She looked at me, her eyes clear and settled. "Thank you, Mom," she said. "For what?" "For not letting me sleep in the barn, and for not letting me leave. You saved me from myself." "I didn't do it for you," I said honestly. "I did it for us. I chose peace over pride, but I also chose respect over submission." I looked out at the orchard. The trees were gnarled and old, their roots twisted deep into the rocky soil. They had weathered storms, droughts, and pests. They had been pruned violently, cut back to the quick, yet they produced the sweetest fruit. I learned something profound in the wreckage of my relationship with my daughter. Love is not about removing all the obstacles for your children. It is about teaching them how to climb over them. It is not about unconditional surrender. It is about unconditional truth. I had spent my life thinking I was a victim of my circumstances, a woman defined by what she had lost. But as I sat there with my daughter and grandson, I realized I was not a victim. I was a gardener. I had pruned the rot from our lives, however painful the cut had been, so that something healthy could grow in its place. We had chosen the hard path. We didn't choose the nursing home, and we didn't choose the barn. We chose the work. And looking at the life we rebuilt from the mud up, I knew it was the only choice that ever really mattered. If this story touched your heart, please subscribe to the channel and leave a comment below, sharing a time you had to make a tough choice to save a relationship. I'd love to hear your story.